Welcome to Pineland Underground, the official podcast of the United States Army's John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, and the best podcast the military has to offer.
Real, bold, and unrestricted.
We're your hosts, Sergeant Major Chuck Ritter,
Major Bobby Tuttle. Welcome to Pineland Underground.
Welcome back to Pineland Underground. So I'm solo for today's episode. Today's episode is going to be a conversation on the topic of critical thinking. Major Tuttle said that he didn't want to do anything concerning the topic of how to think critically, so he elected to go on a work trip, leaving me with no adult supervision. With that, here we go. So today we have a gentleman in the studio by the name of Charles Faint. He is an active duty lieutenant colonel serving at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He serves as the chair for the study of special operations at the Modern War Institute, and he is also the owner of the Havok Journal. He also serves as the executive director of the Second Mission Foundation nonprofit organization. He is deployed to combat 7 times and has a ton of experience in places like Egypt, Korea, and the Philippines. He also has 5 degrees, and he's trying to get 1 more before he retires, so he's a very educated man. So welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. I'm thrilled to be here with the Underground. Really happy to be back at Fort Bragg. It's been a while.
Awesome. The Modern War Institute, I'm just going to read the mission statement real quick of the Modern War Institute and then the Havok Journal, and we can have our discussion from there. So if you click on the website for Modern War Institute, it says the Modern War Institute at West Point generates new knowledge for the profession of arms, enhances the West Point curriculum, and provides the Army and the nation with an intellectual resource for solving military problems. MWI has 3 mutually supporting functions: research, educate, and integrate. Before we go into any of that, I just want to read what the mission of the Havok Journal is, which is the Havok Journal seeks to serve as the voice of the veterans community through a focus on current affairs and articles of interest to the public in general and the veteran community in particular. We strive to offer timely, current, and informative content with the occasional piece focused on entertainment. We're continually expanding and striving to improve the reader's experience. I read this at the same time because to me, it feels like you have the ultimate job of just double dipping into what you love to do, which is being part of 2 think tanks really at the same time.
Absolutely right. I couldn't ask for a better job. This is my last assignment in the Army. As you mentioned, I'm retiring soon. It's my 2nd tour at West Point. And I think this is something that was missing from me when I was a junior officer, when I was active in the Special Operations community, is things like the Modern War Institute, things like the Pineland Underground podcast, things like the Irregular Warfare Initiative, which I know we'll get to later, things that are focused and accessible to us as young leaders that we can then use later on in our careers. So you mentioned the mission of the Modern War Institute. I'll boil all that down to something my boss, Colonel Sullivan, says often is our job is to win tomorrow's war today. So we're helping educate not only the cadets at West Point, not only the faculty, but the broader U.S. military. Colonel Sullivan and his predecessor, Colonel Howell, would say that we can't accomplish our mission at West Point unless we're also helping the Army. Mm-hmm. So the things that we do, and I know we're going to get into it later on in the episodes with the articles, with the podcasts, with the events that MWI hosts, we help set the conditions to allow the future generation leader, after you and I are long gone from the Army, to win the next series of wars. So that's one of the things that makes it so exciting to work at West Point and at MWI.
And there's some great articles. And in front of me, I printed off an article, just one article from Modern War Institute, one article from Havok Journal that I thought were applicable and tying to exactly what you're saying. Is this is not just for cadets, but it's for anybody. And the article I printed out from Modern War Institute it says, large-scale combat operations lessons learned from Ukraine. I mean, that's not the total title, but that's what it's about. And when you read through there, it's just a study on what Ukraine or what's happening in Ukraine and how can we take lessons from that for the future fight for large-scale combat operations. And they really dig into doctrine and how and kind of articulate and show how the United States Army is probably not as well prepared as we think we are. And if we try to base it off just of our exploits in both Gulf Wars, where we did dominate on a large field, but everybody that was part of that, they're gone, right? So How do we, as a military, look at what's going on there and ensure that we're actually ready for that? Not just say, oh yeah, we could wipe Russians' ass right now with our military, but could we really, if we look at doctrine and how we array, right? But that's a good study from MWI that is applicable to anybody in the military.
I had a very similar thought, Chuck, when I rolled in here today. We're here at SWCC in the center of the Special Operations community, at the center of the universe, Fort Bragg. And as my wife was driving me through here, I saw guys walking around Green Berets, but no combat patches. Mm-hmm. And that's going to happen more and more as guys like you and I go away. We move on to whatever our second mission is after the military. It's going to be fewer and fewer of us in here. I remember when I joined the Army in 95, I think our first sergeant and the battalion commander. We're the only ones in our entire infantry battalion in the 101st that had combat patches and had that combat experience. We just took that experience for granted for so long over the last 20 years that it's going to be a recurring thing, and it's not going to be there anymore. And that's why these podcasts, these articles are so important, so people can go back and say, okay, there's not a lot new going on in the military. So what did these people do when they had this problem? And go back and pull this article and read it, and maybe you get some solutions.
Yeah, and at least even if you don't agree with what's in this article, it gives you the ability to think on it more critically. And
Absolutely right.
And they give you the resources in there. I mean, he puts all those doctrinal manuals in there. So if you say, okay, well, this author doesn't know what he's talking about, well, then you have the means to go click on those and see, okay, wow, he does know what he's talking about. Or you read through and say, no, but let me further apply some critical thinking to
Absolutely
this.
right.
And that's really all it's designed for. It's not, these articles aren't designed to teach you how to think, but more how do you think critically about these subjects, right? They're important.
Right. We like to say that we don't try to tell people what to think. We like to teach them how to think. And like you're describing the critical thinking, I think it's the most important skill that anyone in the military could have, officer, enlisted, senior NCO, is to not accept things that you're told or that you see at face value, but instead dig a little deeper and get to the real truth.
Yep. In fact, I was just having a conversation with my son this morning on a run, and he was asking me, he's like, why is everything so extreme and left and right? And we started talking about just that. And I'm like, well, let me give you some advice. Anytime you want to form an opinion or a strong opinion on something, look at both sides of it. And then,
Absolutely right.
And contrast and debate those things, and then only form a strong opinion once, you have looked at all sides and you think that you're educated enough to make that opinion. Then also, when you have that opinion, they'll always be willing to have somebody challenge that and change the opinion, right?
That's right. When you get new information, you should reevaluate your opinion. Yeah. When you're talking just now, Chuck, I was thinking about a conversation we had in Israel in May. Every year, Yale and West Point take a group of young people from both schools over to Israel and Palestine for 2 weeks of boots on the ground as part of a year-long fellowship. And those young people who are going to be future leaders of America and in the world are targeted by everybody while they're over there. Everybody's got an agenda. Everyone's got a point of view that they want to plant in these young people's heads because they're going to go out and run the world one day. And what I explained to them was I consider everything I'm told as a hypothesis. And then I look for information to confirm or deny it. That's very interesting. I wonder if it's true. And like you just said, over time, my opinion on many things has changed over the years. I have strong feelings about something that I believe is correct until something changes that causes me to readjust that. And I think people, first of all, are less informed than they think they are, including myself, about any number of topics. And also, I think once they form an opinion, it's almost impossible to get it to change. I think it was B.H. Little Hart that said the only thing harder than getting a new idea into a military mind is to get an old one out. And I don't think that's confined to the military. So I completely agree with what you just said about critical thinking.
That is tough, right? Like when somebody has that idea in there and we're inclined to believe the first thing that we're told.
100%. Right? Yep.
So it's like, how do you get past that? But again, it's just people open up their minds a little more, and we're not. And sometimes you don't have to have an opinion, right? Like I am not armed with enough information to have an opinion, and that's fine. You don't have to judge everything. It's an old Stoic thing, right? Like things aren't just asking to be judged all the time. Like, you know what? That's a thing. I can see that it's real, but I'm not going to have an opinion because I just don't know enough about it.
Exactly.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
Right. Before we dig into the Havok Journal, though, because I've got an article here from that publication too. Let's talk about Modern War Institute.
Yeah.
When you go on the website, we had a conversation earlier. I was like, well, all these things are under the website, so you'd assume that they're under the umbrella of the Modern War Institute, but some of them are not. So when you go into there, you got articles, you've got research, you've got podcasts, and you've got all these different initiatives. So starting with the podcast, you've got the Modern War Institute podcast, which is it's very academia, right?
Absolutely right. Yep.
I was listening to one on my way to work this morning about the cyber environment. I found it extremely interesting. Then you get the Spear, which is more designed for really cadets, war stories, stuff like that, right? I mean, I'm familiar with the irregular warfare one, but I want you to kind of get deeper in that. But you get the Urban Warfare Project. And then irregular warfare. So if you can cover those real quick, like what are they? Who are they aligned with?
Yeah, no problem. So you mentioned this article here on Ukraine. Our perhaps expert in MWI on Ukraine is the guy who runs the Urban Warfare podcast. His name's John Spencer. He retired from the Army a number of years ago, but he's now a colonel in the California State Militia, like the good kind of militia out there in California. And he has been to Ukraine for years before this war broke out. When he was part of MWI, he's one of the original founders of the Modern War Institute. And he began to realize how important, well, he always knew how important urban warfare was, but how understudied it was. And one of the first articles he wrote for Modern War Institute that really blew up was about the importance of concrete. And we've all been to Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in Iraq. You see the 12-foot T-walls and things like that, and how useful simple thing like concrete could be in urban warfare. And he started researching, he started writing about it, became very popular. And then when he retired, he became the chair of urban warfare for the Modern War Institute. You see him on the news all the time, John Spencer, talking about the war in Ukraine, talking about urban warfare. Extremely popular right now. In fact, his latest contribution was he created an urban warfare manual that's been translated into Ukrainian and is used in Ukraine to help them resist the Russians. So that's the Urban Warfare Project. Irregular Warfare Initiative is an independent organization that partners with the Modern War Institute for both of our interests. Mm-hmm. So IWI does a lot of the same things the Modern War Institute does. They have a podcast, they host events, etc., but with a specific focus, obviously, on irregular warfare, and is headed by Kyle Atwell, who is an instructor at West Point. He's 18 Alpha, longtime Special Forces guy. He and some of his colleagues, when they were in grad school at Princeton, recognized that there was this gap in knowledge about irregular warfare, and they decided to fill it. And they've made this huge, great initiative, is what they call it, that helps spread the word about IWI, but they're about irregular warfare through the IWI. But they're an independent organization that we help. So we partner them, help them get their legs underneath them. We help them with server space. We help them with contacts and things like that. And they're probably going to grow up and become independent and branch out on their own, which is great for us because we'll still be partnering with them.
Are they at Princeton, or are they just aligned with Princeton?
So they're aligned with Princeton. So Kyle is physically at West Point. He's an instructor in the Department of Social Sciences, and he'll be there for 2 or 3 years before he goes back out in the force. There's an organization at Princeton that is the Princeton's partner organization with MWI to help IWI. So urban warfare is ours, IWI is independent. And one other thing related to, similar to IWI, is Project 6633, which refers to the latitudes of the polar areas. Mm-hmm. So that's another organization that has partnered with us to study Arctic warfare, because that's also understudied. So those are some of the big things we've got going on in MWI right now.
And then people can link to these sites, though, through the MWI website, correct?
Absolutely. Come to the website. You can get all the podcasts, you can get all the articles and all the partner organizations. The newest one, we have one that's focused on cyber, which I'm super excited about. That's going to be huge for us in the future, too.
That's just going to be a podcast just dedicated to cyber?
So podcast articles, it's very similar to IWI. It'll probably become independent at one point. But we're basically an incubator for some of these organizations to grow up and then go out there and do their own thing. But we'll always be partnered with them.
Besides all the information that's out there on the Modern War Institute mm-hmm. and the Havok Journal, mm-hmm. people can contribute, right? If you guys saw on the website that there's a whole instructions, like if you want to contribute, if you have an idea or you want to write about a topic, anybody can submit that, correct?
That's correct. There's a high bar for publication. When in the early days of the Modern War Institute, we were founded in 2016. I was at West Point, but not affiliated with MWI at the time. There had a lot fewer submissions, a lot less content to pick from. Now the bar is kind of high. There's a lot of folks that submit, and unfortunately we can't publish everything because we don't want to water down the content. If you read an article on MWI, it's carefully researched, it's carefully edited and curated. So, but anyone can submit. And you and I were talking before the podcast, sometimes we have cadets submit articles as well, but they got to be really good. Yeah. Most recent one that I can think of was an article that a cadet partnered with an active duty Special Forces officer to write about Special Forces in the Arctic. And that was a great article. But yeah, anyone should write in it, and they frequently do.
And we haven't really dove into Havok Journal, mm-hmm. but the same thing, right? Anybody can submit to have something published that they feel is a topic of interest that they think that they would like to get out.
Absolutely. And the Havok Journal is much more bloggish. Like we were founded to give veterans a voice to talk, because a lot of people find it just so therapeutic to see their words, even if it's not their real name, because a lot of people, including me, write under a pseudonym for Havok for various reasons. But to see their words in print and to see the comments on it and to know that it meant something to somebody, it is very therapeutic for these guys to see. And it helps other vets also. Because a lot of vets, I think that they're the only ones who have faced X situation. And they just kind of internalize it and deal with it on their own. But to see someone else dealing with it and writing about it really helps them out. So that's why we do that.
What's the process for the Havok Journal? Is it less strict that I'm taking?
100%, yeah. So I'll just say that our publication standards might be a little bit lower. And we also publish several articles a day on Havok versus MWI because of the editing that goes into it. They can only publish a couple times a week.
Yeah, on Havok, I mean, you've got some interesting contributors there. If you go to the list of people, you got Matt Best.
Yeah.
And Vargas, the guy that was in
Yes,
yep. 15. Some of those board on the entertainment piece that you're talking about?
Yeah. So what was really interesting is Matt Best also did the introduction, the foreword for the book that I helped co-authors called Violence of Action, the 75th Ranger Regiment and the War on Terror. And the primary author on that, his name is Marty Scoveland, who now works for Black Rifle Coffee Company. He's an actor. He does any number of other things. He's the one that founded Havok Journal. So Marty was a staff sergeant in the Ranger Regiment and then became a recruiter and decided he wanted to try his hand in entrepreneurship. And he set up a business. And I became partners with him, and I was the editor for the Havok Journal. Marty grew that business so big, he grew it enough to sell it. He sold it out, and then as my part of the proceeds for that was I got to keep the Havok Journal. I've been running it since. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, you probably know this, Chuck, but for your listeners who don't, if you are active duty in the Army, you have to have permission to run a side business. Mm-hmm. Your side hustle, if you do it right, you've got to get permission. And at West Point, it's the same thing, but they have even more restrictions because, let's face it, it's a very public organization, and you don't want somebody doing something untoward. So I had to get permission from the academy to do it. It was actually way easier than I expected to run the Havok Journal legally through West Point because they just checked it out, found out we weren't doing anything illegal, and they said, good luck with it. Mm-hmm. So I've been doing that for about 8 years now.
And the intent of both of them are kind of the same, right? If you look at what you're doing with MWI and Havok Journal, right? It's giving a platform to put out relevant information that people can go through and read. I mean, I think the Havok, as you said, can be more of a therapeutic means for soldiers too, which is pretty cool. In fact, one of your authors I was talking to was a police guy up in New York, I believe.
Iman. Yep.
Yeah, Iman. So, and that's what he was saying. It was very therapeutic for him to write and publish through.
Iman's a great guy. Have you met him in person yet?
I haven't, no.
So I went up, he had an event up in Boston. I went up to support it, a veterans event. He's just a great guy, fun-loving guy, grew up in Lebanon, served the American Army, now a police officer. And he's just kind of typical of the authors that we get on Havok. Everyone writes for free, including me, but telling our story and getting out there, it helps people. And he wrote an article a couple of days ago about Uvalde, about the police reaction to the Uvalde shootings, and it went viral, and it's blowing up huge right now.
Oh, that's awesome. So people can find that on the Havok.
On the Havok, yep. And that's something that we wouldn't publish in MWI because it's not as academic, it's not as modern war focused.
Mm-hmm. It's more opinion based. Right?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And did it still go through an editing process for the Havok?
Yes. So my best friend who lives in town, this guy I had dinner with last night, his name's Mike. Mike's father and my father served together in JSOC. That's how I met him back in the 8th grade, in '85. When I came back to JSOC as a major, Mike's dad was still there. He's retired, and Mike's dad ended up working for me in one of those weird quirks of the Special Operations community. And I thought that was going to be weird. It's like, Mr. Mike, who used to school me in basketball when I was little, he now works for me in JSOC, but it wasn't. It worked out really well. So I think it's kind of another indicator of the Special Operations community, how unique it can be. That's awesome. Mike edits the Havok Journal. I own it, and I put all my time into doing the modern war stuff right now.
Minimal towards the Havok Journal, most of your effort towards MWI.
Yep.
So this kind of runs itself, or the Havok Journal kind of runs itself.
It does through Mike, and there's another woman named Elisa who I've only met in person a couple times, but has been partners with me in this from the beginning. She lives out in Colorado. And my sister Kathy does a lot for us also. So the four of us kind of run it, but we got a little empire that run out of my basement in Highland Falls, New York, that we try to help vets that way.
So moving back to the Modern War Institute, right? We talked about enabling critical thinking between the two of them and being a think tank. How do you guys choose the topics for MWI? Or do people just come to you and say, hey, I think this is something of interest? Or are you driving the train on what you want to evaluate and think about before you publish something?
Great question. So it's kind of a combination of the two. So being kind of a larger and growing publisher, we don't know from day to day what we're going to get submitted. Right. So it's like we get a lot of stuff on Ukraine right now. We get a lot of stuff on LISCO. We get a lot of stuff on special operations from time to time. So we don't know from day to day, but we will put out some things from time to time about, hey, we're very interested in this subject. Mm-hmm. So we have a director of research who's a PhD. His name's Max Margoli. He's a great guy, real smart, been at West Point about as long as I have at this point. He'll put out topics that he's interested in. Like we'd like to have a series on the Arctic, or we'd like to have a series on the future of physical fitness in the military, whatever. And just use those examples. I don't think Max has had those as research topics. And we'll put that out there and say, hey, we're interested in this, and we'll solicit those types of things. And we'll either publish them on MWI, or Max will put them out in what we call a periodical, like a series of research reports. Or something else I'm really excited about is we're starting a journal at MWI called the Journal of War Studies, that we can take these more in-depth articles and research and put them out there both in print and in hard copy for people to use in future research.
Awesome. Is it mostly officers, though, that submit, or is it...
No. No. Officers, cadets, civilians, anybody can submit to MWI. I'm trying to think. We'd have to ask John Amble, the editor, or Tim Heck, his assistant, for a demographic about it. But I can't think of anyone that's like, it's all officers or it's all Special Forces 18 Foxes, or it's a variety. And it's not just Americans either. One of the most popular articles that MWI has ever published was written by a guy named Sandor Fabian, who, if I remember correctly, was Hungarian. And his article was related to what he thought the Special Forces Selection Assessment course should change in order to make it more relevant to what way we're going to be fighting in the future. Huge article. And he's a foreign officer. I'm sorry, he's a foreign NCO.
And that one's on the website now?
Yeah. Yep. I'll send you a link because it's super popular article. Very controversial, too.
It's interesting that it's a foreign officer, not an American officer. Did he go through the Q course?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense then of how he'd know what was in there. That's interesting. The fact that you guys would publish that, too, is pretty cool. That kind of shows our partnership there. So on the website and talking to you, one of the missions is to influence the curriculum of West Point, right? So how does people submit these things? You guys do these research projects. How does that tie into that POI and changing what we're teaching our up-and-coming Army officers?
This is one of the things we're most proud of. And my previous boss, Colonel Howell, started a process that we're still using now under the current director of basically pushing out the information that we've got. So we've got all this information, but if you go to the website, because we've been around so long and there's so many articles, sometimes it's hard to find specific things. So we've categorized the information to make it easier to find. And then what we'll do is we'll push it out to the different departments at West Point. Everybody knows each other. We don't work together on a daily basis because you got the math department, social sciences, et cetera, et cetera. But email's easy enough. It's like, hey, we just published this article on this subject. I think it would be great for this class that you teach. And if we drill down enough, for this lesson that you're teaching on this subject, here's an article for it. That's helpful for us. And then the instructors will look at it, because we teach too. We'll look at it and say, okay, I'll use this or I won't. And that's one of the ways we get it into the curriculum. Also, a lot of the instructors at West Point, as well as the cadets themselves, are avid consumers of Modern War Institute's publications, either the print or specifically the Spear that you mentioned earlier, super popular with cadets. So that's how we get that information out there. And we could see, because most of the syllabi are published, the course syllabi are published, we can get those and we can see where it's influencing the curriculum. More specifically to that, all of us that work in the Modern War Institute teach or can teach. Like last year I taught a course called Leadership in Future War, which it's a capstone course for the Defense and Strategic Studies major. And that was heavy on MWI information and speakers and podcasts and things like that. And all of the other instructors at Modern War Institute teach in DSS or history or somewhere else, and they bring that curriculum and experience with them. And the cadets find it on their own. I have folks coming up to me all the time to talk to me about stuff that they read in MWI or something they heard on the Spear podcast.
Do you personally still deal with the students and cadets?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm in a weird situation now. Like we talked about before the show, I'm retiring in November, and MWI has graciously allowed me to stick around as a chair for Special Operations. So I'm not going to teach this semester because I'm going to be gone, and I'm retired in November, and you don't want to jerk the cadets around. Yeah. But I love teaching. I've taught, a half dozen or more courses over the course of now going into 8 years at West Point. I love teaching. I did not go to West Point. As you know, Chuck, I went to Georgia Military College and Mercer University. But I found out when I was in 5th Group, we took a boondoggle trip to West Point because one of the guys in my Sod A had a brother that was there. Got up there, fell in love with it, and found out I could teach there. It was a long process of getting rejected multiple times before I finally landed a job in the Department of Social Sciences, and taught there for a number of years. Went to Hawaii, USARPAC for a couple of years. Actually did not like that for a number of reasons that are important for this conversation, and then came back to West Point. Yeah, I try to stay positive. I did not have the experience I thought I was going to have at USARPAC, but I got to come back and got to be part of MWI, so it all worked out.
So I'm going to pose this question.
Yeah, man.
It might be a little controversial to some people. So recently I was talking to the outgoing Special Forces 18 Alpha, the officer course director. He just switched out. And I was asking him, what have they seen? What are the trends with officers coming to the course that are causing them to not do so well or that cause concern? And in my mind, I figured it would be, okay, well, a lot of these guys are, especially the ones coming out of the academies are probably too cocky, whatever. And he blew my mind. He's like, no, that's sometimes a problem. Maybe like 5-10%, maybe even less than that, of guys that just they're too much into themselves and they can't course correct, so their own ego brings them down because nothing's their fault. He's like, surprisingly enough, the biggest problem that we have with Army officers coming through the course is a lot of them just aren't decisive and assertive enough in the situations they need to be assertive. Like when you bring them aside, like, hey, why didn't you do that? Well, you go, well, I didn't feel like, if I did that, I might piss somebody off, or I might do this. And he said that was the number one problem right now with people coming through the course, is that for whatever reason, he felt people were just less decisive and assertive than in the past. I don't know if you guys have seen the same thing or what your opinion is.
So I don't know that I've seen that specifically, but it goes back to something that I try to emphasize not only to West Point cadets, but to any young potential officer that I mentor, is I think people misunderstand when they're told listen to your NCOs or listen to your soldiers. Mm-hmm. I think they misunderstand that as do what they tell you to do all the time without question. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes to what you're talking about right now. If you're the officer, or if you're the 18 Zulu on the team and there is no officer, you're the person in charge. You need to listen to everybody, but you need to make your own decisions. I think a lot of young officers in particular struggle with that. And that gets them in trouble, not so much tactically, but morally, I think. And we study some of the case studies at West Point about this, like the story about Black Hearts. They know what to do, but they're being told to do something different. And in their minds, they're like, hey, I need to listen to these people. Listen to them, but make your own decisions. Think critically. Rely on your background and what you're seeing in front of you, and then go with that. So I think that might relate to that issue you're seeing, Chuck.
Especially in the special operations community, it's a hard job for an officer coming in, especially as a captain, because you're in charge and the buck stops with you. Like, the decisions are yours to have. And I've seen officers that were fired for things that happened and they weren't even there. I saw an officer go to dive school. Something stupid happened on his team in South America, and the officer still was fired for that offense, right? Because some of his decisions did play into the culture of the team, is what happened there. Mm-hmm. But an officer has to come in to this environment where you have all these experienced people, and in special operations, the egos are pretty large, right? We all know better than everybody else, and everything sucks. The gold's always too heavy, but they have to come in, and they have to be that guy, like you're saying, or that girl. Like, okay, I have to listen, but I'm the decision maker for a lot of things, and I have to accept the fact that you have to humble yourself to accept the fact that I don't know as much as these people. So I have a lot to learn, but also the decision is mine at the end of the day, and I'm going to be the one that takes the fall. You guys are going to probably take the glory for it, but I'm going to take the fall if it goes bad. And it's weird. Like, I'm glad I didn't choose to become an officer for a reason. I can just shirk all the responsibilities at the time. But I don't know. It wasn't my decision. But yeah, that's one of those things, and you have to balance it out. Where do I need to be assertive, and I take this information, but nope, my decision goes against the grain, and you're fine with that because you're not there to be boys. You're not there to be friends.
That's right.
The formation, right? Every officer made that conscious choice to be commissioned, and that comes with, it's lonely at the top too. So not that you have to come and be an asshole, but.
I was thinking about my own experience as second lieutenant. I am an intel officer. I came in the branch detail program, so I did 4 years in the infantry before I went MI. First duty station, 101st Airborne Division, Fort Campbell, mid-90s. So you probably remember the mid-90s, Chuck. No money, no personnel, nothing. So it was hard. And my platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Ellery Edwards, who I've lost contact with and regret, best NCO in the Army, would allow me to be in charge and make the mistakes that I needed to make without them being complete failures. Mm-hmm. There's one in particular I still remember. My wife laughs about this story. We had a tow platoon. So we had the heavy weapons platoon in 1st Battalion of the 327. And I wasn't trained a lot on the, fighting from the back of a truck in the infantry basic course. We didn't cover that a whole lot. So we went to the field one time when I first got there, and I was delivering a briefing to the squad leaders and everything, and told them, all right, we're going to dismount the 50s and we're going to put them over here in this little patrol base we stopped in for the night. And I was looking at the audience, and Sergeant Edwards was like, okay, we can do that. The squad leaders were shaking their heads no. And I was like, okay, then I'll put the 50s over here, shaking my head. They're shaking their heads no subtly so the soldiers couldn't see it. Like, okay, I'm going to leave the 50 cals on the truck so we can drive off if we need to leave. And they're like, yes. So I appreciated that. I appreciated that from Sergeant Edwards because he was going to let me make that decision. He wasn't going to correct me in front of the troops because he knew that this decision would, first of all, no one's there but us. Mm-hmm. So it'd be a learning experience for me. At the same time, he would let me make those decisions, do discovery learning on my own. And I think we need more of that of NCOs who are willing to mentor young officers, let them make mistakes that aren't complete failures. Like if the battalion commander or someone would have been there, they would have kept me from making that call. And I was very grateful that we didn't do that, because I'd never dug a 50 caliber fighting position before, and that would have been a lot of work. So yeah, I think that goes back to that relationship we were talking about before between officers and NCOs. And I think that's one thing that we can work on better with all commissioning sources, is helping cadets, ROTC, West Point, understand that relationship. Because if it's done right, it's beautiful at all levels of command, from platoon sergeant on up.
Yeah. And as an NCO, one of your primary goals with mentoring that officer is to, hey, my evaluation or how I even see life is based on how you rate. So, if you've got 18 officers or 24 officers in the ranks, like my goal is year 1 through 4. My goal is number 1, but you should try to get that officer to that point.
That's right.
In the special operations community, just for me, and people can have some gripe on this. Whenever I see an officer come to a special forces detachment and the team's already trying to get rid of him in the first 3 months, it's like, okay, well, you guys are screwed up, because what are you doing to try to get this person to where that person needs to be?
That's right.
So what's going on? It's two sides. Like, maybe he is screwed up, but what are you doing to get him to where he's not screwed up, right? It's your job to also mentor this person to get him there, right? So
yeah.
People just need to take a look at that too. It's like, okay, you don't like this guy's personality. Okay, maybe just check your own ego and try to help this guy get to where he needs to be. Or girl, right?
That's a great way to do it. And yeah, you're absolutely right, because at some point, you got to cut sling load. Your rucksack's out in the hall if you're not cutting it eventually. But I was a company commander 4 times. The first one was in Korea right as 9/11 was happening, because pre-9/11 Army in the conventional force, Korea is where you went to do something hard. So I went to Korea. My wife was also in the Army, and she's 2nd Infantry Division. I was in the MI battalion for 2nd Infantry Division, and I had the linguist company. Great learning experience. Had 7 lieutenants rotate through over the time that I was in command. And one of the things that I did at the beginning that I stopped doing, and I'll explain why later, is when the lieutenants showed up, I did initial counseling with them and the platoon sergeant, had a great roster of platoon sergeants. And with the lieutenant there, I had the platoon sergeant sign a hand receipt for the lieutenant for the for the reasons that you identified right now. It's like, it's your responsibility to make sure this lieutenant has the tools to do their job. Ultimately, it's the lieutenant's job. I rethought that and stopped doing it, because I thought about it. I was like, I'm absolving the lieutenant of responsibility by doing this. Yeah. I thought it was funny. I thought the platoon sergeants loved it, but I needed to rethink that, because you're still in charge, lieutenant. This hand receipt thing, yeah, it's funny and all that, but at the same time, this is your platoon. You're in charge. So I stopped doing it for a while, but that's what the kind of relationship I wanted to have, is what you described. And fortunately, for most of the time I was in Korea and the other commands later on, that's what we had. Most of my experiences with NCOs have been very good.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I might have to try that one. Yeah. In fact, let me write that down real quick.
For captains, it might work better. I think everyone will appreciate the joke. For lieutenants, it's literally their first duty station ever.
They're just scared, right?
They don't know what's going on. Oh, my God, big, scary company commander. And my platoon sergeants were huge, too. And they'd been in the Army for 10 years or more. And this lieutenant's literally been in a year, straight out of Huachuca into Korea.
I think the principle behind receiving a new officer is the principle we should apply to anybody coming in, right? Hey, you're a new person.
Yeah.
And no matter what your rank is or your job, you have to prove yourself. Nobody cares what you did yesterday. Nobody cares how educated you are.
No,
what
they
your
don't.
Accomplishments were.
Whether you went to West Point or not.
You think you are. People only care about what are you going to bring to the table right now for this organization, whatever your rank is. So you got to come in and you got to prove yourself, right? But it's everybody else's responsibility on the flip side to ensure that this person coming in, regardless of rank, is successful. So how do we do that? How do we indoctrinate this person into the proper culture? How do we educate this person and train them to where they can be? And then, like you said, at some point you got to cut sling load.
Yeah.
Where is that? But everybody, even if a junior person on the team is screwing up, you owe it to that person, like, hey, let me sit you down. Let me tell you exactly why you're screwing up. Let's map out the plan to get you to where excellence is.
Yes.
And then we'll do everything we can to get you there. And at some point in time, if you're not there, we're going to cut sling load on you. But you got to tell the person, at this point, if you are not at this place in the timeline, you're done, right? You just got to have that honest conversation. We got to do the same thing with the officer. Like, hey, sir, this is where you fit in. This is where you need to be, and I need you. I mean, I think I said this on a podcast before, but one of my team leaders always jokes that I gave him a negative counseling statement as an on his birthday. I didn't know it was his birthday, but he was doing some stupid stuff, and it wasn't, even though he's my boss as a captain, but I've been doing it at that point for 14 years, however long. It's like, no, hey, sir, this is where we need to go, right? And it's like, yep, I appreciated that, and it helped us to get to where we needed to go. But having that honest conversation on both sides, I think, is key, right? He's in charge. He has to counsel those NCOs, but also those NCOs need to counsel that person.
Yes,
too, right?
they do. They absolutely do. And Chuck, I want to kind of flip the script a little bit here. You know, we were talking before. I just dropped my daughter off at Georgia Military College. Hopefully, she'll end up at West Point after a year of prep. But they're already thinking about their first meeting with their platoon and their platoon sergeant. Mm-hmm. So, one thing just off the top of your head, what's one thing that you want a lieutenant to be prepared to do day one when they show up at the unit? What's one thing that you or your soldiers or your team is going to be looking for out of that officer?
Man, day one, really looking for an officer to come in and demonstrate that they want to be there for the right reasons, right? Because you see a lot of people that you see it when NCOs go warrant, or the officers, they join because they want that prestige, or in my opinion, if you ever hear an officer say, I'm only doing this thing right here as a stepping stone to this, that should immediately be cut, because A, that shows that you're a selfish prick, and 2, you're stupid enough to say that out loud in front of everybody. Like, it's a double whammy, right? And maybe you are. You should have future plans, but if that's your motivation, like you're just telling that person, hey, I don't really give a shit about what we're about to do. I'm just doing this because I got better stuff on the horizon, right? So really, is that officer there for the right reasons? And the right reasons is, if we just look at the military or the Army's definition of leadership, provide purpose, direction, motivation, but improve the organization. Are they there? Anybody can come sit in that officer billet for 2-3 years, right? Anybody can do that, right? Anybody can sit in any job, but the litmus test is, what did you come there and what did you leave behind that was enduring? What did you come there to, what did you inspire in people? What did you do systems and SOPs wise and everything else that endured past your tenure there? And that's really, I think that's what any officer that shows up, like, what are you doing here that's about more than just you, really? And that's the first thing, like, why are you here? And if it's, I'm here to make a difference, right? Because there's a lot of officers out there that are just okay with being mediocre, and they are fine. I don't know, when they die, they're going to be on their deathbed and like, you know, I was a mediocre officer. I got my special forces tab. I was mediocre. I'm okay with that. Like, I don't know how that works, but there's plenty of them out there. But every day that officers show up, like, I don't want to be a mediocre officer. I'm here. I volunteered. I got a commission. I made that choice. This is what I'm designed to do, and I want to make sure that, you know, I'm doing it for this organization and these people, right? They care about the people. They care about the organization. They care about the mission, and they're going to try to improve that every single day. That's
Love it. Love that answer.
So
good.
That's another talk about, like, they got to come. You expect an officer to come and care. They don't have to love everybody in their platoon, but they have to care about them. They don't have to love the mission they're being given, but to care about it because they're putting their name on it. And they don't have to completely love the organization they're in, but they made a decision to be there. They volunteered to be in the military. They have to care about it, right? And if you can care about those 3 things, you can be a great leader. If you can't care about those 3 things, then you'll still be a leader. You're just not going to be a great leader, right? So that's a long way to answer your question.
I think it's a great answer. Also, I was thinking about a conversation we had earlier about MWI and about leadership. And I think one of the things that makes MWI successful, in addition to our partnership with the Defense and Strategic Studies individuals, is the heavy soft theme that's been inherent in MWI since the beginning. The first director of the Modern War Institute, Colonel retired Liam Collins, was an old school CAG guy, Special Forces tabbed out. And many, if not most of the folks in MWI and DSS are some flavor of Special Operations, Ranger, or SF. In fact, last year, I think 4 of the 6 DSS instructors were SF guys. It was kind of funny because 3 of them were middle-aged, bald, white guys all named Matt. It was very confusing in there. You go call Matt, and everyone with the green beret turns and looks at you. They were super guys, and I think that it's, first of all, very comfortable for me. I love working in that type of environment where you just, here's your left and right limits, go. And also, it works well because if you're going to be recruiting for academic majors and classes, who do you want to go have as your teacher? I want that guy. I want Sergeant First Class Johnson, who works for us in MWI, and it heads up West Point's dive department. I want that guy to be my military science instructor. I want this person to teach me strategic studies. And I think that's been very helpful both for the academy and for the Special Forces branch, because you got such great representatives, officers, NCOs of your core, the Special Forces organization, that as soon as they can drop that packet when they're 1 LTP, they're out trying to go to SFAS and the Q course, or they're trying to go to the Ranger Regiment, or they want to be a PSYOPer. So I think that's been a strength of MWI and Department of Military Instruction and Defense and Strategic Studies, is we have such a heavy soft theme there.
It might almost work too well, because recently we just had this huge backlog of officers. We had too many officers in the course, and we didn't have any slots for them, right? So maybe it was too effective, right?
Well, send them up to West Point to be instructors for a little while. We could use them, put them right to work.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Pass it on to the CG. See if he likes it. We're talking about education of officers and mentorship of officers. So we have our military academies. Mm-hmm. In your opinion, and this is probably going to be biased, what do you think sets West Point apart?
Okay. First of all, totally biased. But what's interesting is, I mentioned before, I didn't go to West Point. Mm-hmm. I went to GMC, I went to Mercer, came into it late. I think that the focus on character at the academies and the everyday focus on becoming a military officer is what sets it apart. That's why I taught there for so long. That's why I encourage my daughter to apply there. That's why I encourage anyone who wants to be an officer in the Army, I encourage them to think about going to West Point. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying everyone should go. I think there's a lot of benefit in doing the ROTC route, the OCS route, other ways to get commissioned. But I think if you want to be a career Army officer, West Point is probably the best place to go. The resources they have, the instructors they have, the guest speakers they have, and the little West Point network after graduation is huge. And if you look at the senior ranks of the Army, it's dominated by West Pointers. It's the smallest commissioning source. It has the highest proportion, grossly disproportionate number of general officers in the highest positions in the Army.
It's almost like a cult, right? Like
yeah. Or
talk about ring knockers. It's a real thing, right?
They talk about the West Point Mafia, and that is a thing. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think anybody who's had a shared experience, we look like people who have had experience to us when we're building the team to go forward. Mm-hmm. So these folks either knew each other or they know someone that knows somebody, and I think that's helpful as they go on. And even for the guys who do what we call 5 and fly, the West Point commitment is 5 years active, 3 years Guard or Reserve. Mm-hmm. So they do 5 years active duty and they get out. They go into business and they have the West Point and the Army genre in them, and they use that to grow their business, and then they give back to the communities and they give back to West Point. And that's a strength that West Point has that Mercer University's ROTC department did not have. We did not have a sugar daddy who runs a major footwear company giving us millions of dollars for these enhancing programs. Mm-hmm. We didn't have that. We didn't have a 3-star general in charge of our school. We didn't have 4 stars showing up on the regular to have lunch with cadets. I don't even remember the first time I talked to a 4-star general. I still don't remember. I mean, it's happened, but it definitely didn't happen when I was 19 years old. And that goes back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier about some of the problems young officers can think. I think West Pointers in particular have a problem understanding that the way you're treated as a cadet is not the way you're treated as an officer. Mm-hmm. You're not just going to walk up to Lieutenant Colonel Faint, who's your B-hour instructor, when you're a lieutenant in the 101st. You'll get destroyed by probably the sergeant major and the company commander and everybody else, because they become overly familiar. They don't understand that, especially in the conventional force, that structure exists for a reason. And they're a little too familiar with higher ranking officers.
Yeah. That happens.
Yeah.
I do like, just sticking to officer side, one of the things I love, and every officer does this in their career, right? But it's usually lieutenants or captains, but they will just outwardly make this statement. They'll say, last time I checked, I outrank a sergeant major. And although technically they are correct, it's always fascinating. Like, yeah, go and see what happens. Do that.
Oh my God!
It never pans out the way they think.
That's such a rookie move.
Because yes, you are right. But there's power and influence.
That's a yes but thing. It's like, oh yeah, go tell the battalion commander that.
Yes, that's great. You're really onto something. But I'm pretty sure every officer in their career said that at least at one point in time, right? I don't know. You were talking about West Point cadets, and you were talking about the familiarity thing, and I was like, yeah, but also.
I did that as a lieutenant. I didn't know any better. I was at 101st, and we had to do a layout inspection. And I didn't want the sergeant major to inspect my gear. I had it. It was good. But I was like, sergeant major doesn't need to inspect my gear. I'm the platoon leader. Inspect the soldiers. So the battalion commander came down and inspected my gear, and that did not go well. He went through all my shit and just it was a good learning experience, and just kind of a humility thing. And now looking back at it, I don't know why I thought that. I was like, why not? The sergeant major's probably going to help me. If Sergeant Edwards managed to overlook something, and he didn't, I knew my gear was straight because I had Sergeant Edwards as a platoon sergeant. But I just got it in my head. It's like, sorry, I'm an officer. Sergeant Major does not need to inspect my gear. Yeah, that ended poorly, Chuck. But, learn from my mistakes, cadets and lieutenants.
Yeah, and it always comes out like, that humility piece. Everybody has an ego, right? We all have egos, and all of us, we have to either check them ourselves or figure out how to check them. But one of the things that I've learned with really good officers is the way to ensure an officer is successful through their career is you got to constantly just check their ego. Like I used to have this joke about, like when the captain leaves his team room, it's almost like there's this helium filter that just blows up his ego. It's a balloon in his head. He's like floating away, right? You got to pop that thing. But I found that, and once you start believing in your own hype, I've seen really great officers and even really great NCOs, once they start believing in their own hype, and at some point in your career, nobody's checking you anymore, right? They're not telling you the truth, and then they're like, oh, yeah, well, all this stuff that I'm saying must be real. I think that's one of the things that we do need to keep doing. It's one of the jobs as an NCO is set this guy up for success, or this person up for success, and also check their ego.
Yes.
And they should be checking your ego, but really that's how you ensure that they are making the right decisions. And
Absolutely.
They're looking at things critically. They're not just, I just have enough information to where I'm dangerous. Like earlier we talked about critical thinking. They haven't thought through the problem set critically enough to have an informed opinion, and they're just making a decision, right? So I think that's kind of key there. But I was surprised, going back to our 18 Alpha conversation, even a lot of the West Point grads, they're finding they're just not as assertive and decisive enough. I'm like, oh, that's weird. Usually, I joke about West Point all the time. I was like, oh yeah, I was like, how long does it take you after West Point before you really realize that you're not better than everybody because you graduated West Point, right? I just talk smack to all my friends that are West Point grads. But the reality is, where's that balance now? You're talking about that maybe they're too familiar. Yes, you are an officer. You're coming out. You have a commission, but where do you balance that? I'm in charge versus I need to listen, but really you still need to be assertive. You still need to be decisive. Decisive, if anything, decisive for, after you've thought through the problem set critically, right? Which, again, you have all these things available, like MWI, the Havok Journal, doctrine. Yeah. You'd be surprised at how many officers think doctrine is stupid. It's
amazing you say that, Chuck. And one of the articles I wrote under my real name on the Havok Journal was railing against this outside the box thinking. Mm-hmm. And the people that say that the most, I think, outside the box, in my experience, are the ones who think the least about what's in the box and why it's there.
They just don't even know what's in there.
They know. And I hear this a lot from cadets. RTC West Point, doesn't matter. And it really annoys me. Like, there are a few things I'll just snap on a cadet about because it's developmental, but this is one of them. Oh, I like to think outside the box. You don't know what's in the box. You don't know why it was created. And the ego of saying, I'm going to think outside the box without even learning the tenets of your profession, very frustrating. Mm-hmm. Learn what the doctrine is. Doctrine is useful. Learn the doctrine, and then if you need to vary.
Most of it's been tested.
Exactly
over
right.
time, right?
We've tried your stupid idea before, cadet. It doesn't work.
Yeah. And you can operate outside the box. You can be innovative about operating outside the box if you've already gone through the litmus test of, okay, I've tried to be adaptive and work inside the box. The solution's not there, but I guarantee you 99% of the time, whatever you do that's innovative is going to springboard off something that's inside the box.
That's right.
Already a proven principle.
That's right.
That makes sense, right?
If you think about it, for those of you who want to try to think outside the box, thinking outside the box is inherently in the box. If you look at the principles of Mission Command, exercise disciplined initiative is part of the process. So if you're exercising disciplined initiative, you're in the box to begin with. You're just thinking creatively and critically, which is what we want you to do. It's one of the reasons we have officers in the first place.
No doctrine, know the rules. You can be adaptive. Most of that stuff works if you're adaptive, right? But
yes.
When people say, well, I operate outside the box, but if that person can't define the box, they're not operating outside the box, just pulling things out of their ass.
Yes.
That's what they're saying.
Yes.
And anytime anybody comes to me and says the same thing, anybody says, well, we don't use doctrine, we operate outside the box, I just shut that person off. Like, he just told me he doesn't know what he's talking about. Right?
Yeah.
And again, you can be adaptive or innovative, but most of the things that are in the box actually work.
Yeah.
Or at least parts of it work for what you're trying to achieve.
And it gives you a foundation. And by no means are you and I saying that you should be bound by doctrine, but at least understand it.
You don't have to be constrained by the rules.
Right.
But you should know the rules, right? It's like you can use the rules to your advantage.
Yeah.
Right? If you know the rules, like, hey, sir, I'm telling you that I need $50,000. I need you to underwrite this risk. I need X amount of ammunition because, look, these aren't my rules. They're in your command training guidance. It's aligned with Army Regulation 3-1. Like, I didn't make this stuff. I think it's dumb to go down and hang out in Nevada for 3 weeks and drop, bombs and have a really good time. But this is the rules. I didn't make this up.
Right.
So this is why I need it. Right? So you're just using the rules to your advantage.
That's right. That sounds pretty awesome to me, actually, Chuck. Yeah.
So, yeah, and knowing doctrine is like, what are you basing this off of? well, sir, I've done my research. I'm basing this off, whatever. This is pulled out of this 350-1. This is pulled out of, FM5-0. This is how I'm backing up my logic. And the commander can still say no because they're in charge, but you're mitigating the chance of them arguing against your logic, right? You've done the math. You've done the homework. This is what it is. It's not just I was being innovative, or I was operating outside the box, sir. And most of those people will go to the commander. They'll brief the outside the box concept. And the commander's like, "What the hell?" And they denied, and they're pissed about it. The commander's so stupid because it's a game, right? But what people don't realize is other people playing the game, and in a resource-constrained environment, the person that plays the game the most effectively, who probably understands the rules, they're going to dominate the game.
That's right.
So, I think for officers to think like, "Hey, man, you volunteered to be an officer, at least know the game." Right?
Yeah.
That's a big one. Like, you chose to play the game, and if you choose to play a game, the first thing you do is open the box and read the rules. Right?
Yeah.
There's no draft.
Yeah, and I've actually been rather impressed with the West Point cadets in general and their ability to innovate when they're encouraged to do so. What I thought was interesting is one of the most perplexing things that I could do as an instructor is tell a cadet, write a paper on anything you want.
Anything?
Anything you want. It's got to be, here's some requirements, Chicago style, 5 pages or whatever.
You guys do Chicago style
but
at this point?
APA Chicago, it varies by instructor. Write a 5-page on any topic you want. They don't like that because they don't know, they want to give the right answer. And what I want to encourage them to do is I want to know what you think, and I want you to think creatively and critically and come up with something on your own. And I did that in the Leadership and Future War course, and I got some really, really interesting articles about things that I didn't know. But one cadet wrote about power beaming, which I didn't even know. It's like the satellite sends power down to you. I'm like, is this really a thing? So it's largely conceptual, but very interesting. Cadets write about whether we should switch from 5.56 to 6.8 before we actually went that route. And then some of them just wrote about personal stories about their cadet experiences. So it's really amazing what people will do if you give them the means and the encouragement to kind of spread their wings and do their own thinking.
Yeah. Critically
think, yes.
Which I think everybody throws that term around, but a lot of people haven't dug into like what does that actually mean. Like, you see in the military like, well, this professional military education course does critical thinking on these things. Like, well, let me see the POI. No, that was a 3-hour PowerPoint.
Well, one of the things I also like about West Point is what they call the Thayer method, which is basically a Socratic method of learning from each other. So we give the cadets readings or videos to watch, and they're expected to do that before class, because normally you have a day in between classes. And they come to class prepared to discuss it. And then we have a sit-down discussion. It's very grad school-like for some of these classes. And some courses, of course, it wouldn't lend itself well, like foreign languages and math and stuff like that. It's probably not the best way to do it. Yeah. But for the social sciences and for the strategic science courses that I'm familiar with, in the officer capstone course, that's the best way to learn, in my opinion. Yeah. Learn from each other.
Yeah, the adult learning methodology or experiential learning methodology that we've gone to. I didn't know they called it a Thayer method. Actually, I didn't know that much about Thayer until recently. One of my buddies, West Point grad, and we were talking about. Actually, I think I was reading up on Teddy Roosevelt or something, and then I got into like how he was friends with this guy, as like a naval guy, but a lot of his theories and everything were very impactful to the military in general. Like, I didn't know the Thayer methodology was a thing. Right?
We literally have a statue to Thayer on West Point's campus. So you got Grant, you got Patton. And then over there you got Sylvanus Thayer.
That's awesome. And then in fact they've got a whole Thayer Hall or something like that there.
Yes.
And that's all designed towards achieving critical thinking and lectures and stuff.
The hall is just named after him.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, the West Point curriculum, to the maximum extent possible, we use the Thayer method, and I think it works really well. So what I try to adopt with my own kids. Sometimes you got to be directive with them, but other times let's do some experiential learning. Here's the background on it. Read up on it. Let's go study a little bit.
And it's not as efficient, right? Because it's not as easy. Like a PowerPoint or a lecture, you don't really have to use your brain. But if you're going to use that type of methodology, you have to apply mental manpower and reading and then think about it and then be ready to present, which achieves a better learning environment.
Absolutely right. And it's also harder on the instructors because I got to keep up with it. Like the first thing I do every class is current events. And that's a technique I borrowed from another instructor when I was learning how to teach at West Point. And that does a couple of things. First of all, I'll make sure cadets are reading something other than sports magazines or something like that. But also it gets them, I have a little app on my phone that's every cadet's name. I have a cadet spin it, and whatever's name lands on it, then they have to do the question of the day or a current event or something like that. So that gets them comfortable talking about things they're not familiar with in front of a group. So I find that very useful. And I also found it useful that the insights that the cadets have. A lot of people think, young people in general, maybe cadets in particular, some people think that they're dumb or uneducated. That hasn't been my experience. And I also tell the cadets we do that because your soldiers and your NCOs are also smart and educated, and they will ask you questions that you better know the answer to.
Yeah.
Like, sir, why are we here?
The why questions.
Why?
Right?
Why are we doing this? Why am I in Poland right now? What's going on in the world? You better be able to explain that to them, Lieutenant, Captain, Colonel. So
That's what they expect from an officer. Is like, hey, sir, explain the why to me.
Exactly right. Yes.
And if you can't do that, then you've already lost that trust, right? It's like, shit, what is this guy getting us into?
He's dumb.
Because I told you to. I outranked the sergeant major.
Right.
Yeah.
Rank the sergeant major.
Yeah, but that is important. Like, and that's the importance of officers going through academies and stuff, so they can base their decisions off the why, not just the, well, this is what I was told to do, right?
Right.
And they can dig through there. I think that's kind of lost sometimes too. It's like, we don't waste all this money, or we don't spend all this money to give officers this education so you can come and do the same thing that everybody else is doing, right?
That's right. NCOs, but as officers as well, have to be able to make good decisions quickly. You don't have to make the perfect decision. You need to make a good enough decision right now. And that takes time and experience and mentorship from NCOs, and also thinking and research. I think officers should be reading all the time, and not just stuff you like the Modern War Institute or Havok Journal, whatever. Popular mechanics. Just like whatever. Read sports, read pop culture so you can relate to your soldiers, because you never know what little tidbit of information might come up later and might be useful. So officers need to be reading everything, watching everything, paying attention to everything, so they have that background, because we don't know what we're going to be doing. There's been so many times in my life, in my career, 27 years in the Army, where I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what's happening right now, but I know something that was close enough to this that I read about or experienced in the past that now I can make a good decision because I need to make one right now.
For the audience members, we have this emergency clown nose in here, which we're not using this episode because Bobby Tuttle's not here, but we issue officer and NCO points during an episode, and I'm going to take my jabs at officers all day long because I can. But if you're using a lot of acronyms, or you're just saying stuff that is clearly just trying to sound smart or whatever, then you get officer points. If you're making sense, it's NCO points, right? But the reality is, it should be flipped as an officer, because you have a very specific role coming in. And like you said, if you're not always, I think it's that continuing education piece, which is something I really want to hit on, is people mistake that a lot of times for just college. But that continuing education piece in somebody's career is ensuring that you are always relevant. Just because you were a badass E7 doesn't mean you're going to be a badass E8 in your new position, because you have to learn a lot more in order to be competent at your new job.
Right.
Same thing with an officer. If you go from being a lieutenant to a captain now you're in a new job, just because you're a badass and you knew everything that applied to this job, well, now when you move to the next position, you check your ego and realize that reputation's one thing, but competence and trust and relevancy is always reinvented every day you come to work. And with every new position, you've got to now ensure that you're educated on what it is that you're about to do, and you're educated on the realities of that environment, which is constantly just, okay, I know this is coming up. Let me start reading this stuff right now and getting my head wrapped around what it is I'm probably going to do. And then when you get in that position, ensure that you maintain relevancy. Because I'm sure you've seen this. A lot of E9s or a lot of NCOs quickly ensure they become irrelevant, because maybe he was a badass breacher. Maybe he was really good at shooting and kicking in doors and doing all this technical stuff. But as an E9, or even like as a higher level E8, like a lieutenant colonel, he doesn't need me to do all that. What he needs me to do is bring the experience to the table, but be educated on everything that now I didn't care about before, and that is seemingly bureaucratic and stupid. And maybe it is, but that you get paid more money to now understand it. So now you can combine that experience with the knowledge and education and advise that commander appropriately, or make decisions on your own accord. But that's what you're bringing to the table. And that's that continuing education piece, is always reading, always learning. I think that when you don't do that, that's when you become irrelevant.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about my own experiences in 5th Group. I was the group MID commander, and I commanded the support company for a while in 5th Group. And one of the things that was frustrating to me that I thought of when you were talking just now, Chuck, is you need to be good at what your job is. Too many of my guys, too many of my intel guys, specifically the SOD A's, wanted to be out doing 18 series stuff and not doing what they're supposed to do. And it was very frustrating to me, is we have a job. I know they make us wear a different color hat, but we're still on the team. Get out there and do your job. You speak Arabic fluently. Go practice that. You don't need to be blowing doors and shooting people in the face in training, because that's not what you're going to be doing when we go to Iraq. Now, some of them did do some of that, so we have to have some of those hard skills. But be good at your job. And that's one of the things I emphasize to my support guys. I'm very comfortable being an MI guy. I know there's somebody cooler than me out there every day. I'm okay with that. I love being an intel guy. I don't want to have a tab. I don't want to be in CAG. I don't want to be a SEAL. I want to do intel work. And that was very rewarding for me. So wherever you are, I've heard people say, bloom where you're planted. Do what your job is. Be good at your job. Don't try to be good at somebody else's job. If you want to go off to you want to go to the Q course, and go to the Q course. You want to earn your tab. If you don't want to do that, be good at your job. Cook, intel, truck driver, operator. Do your job, and everything's going to go a lot better.
Yeah. And as you continue to move up in those jobs, you got to continually educate yourself so you can stay relevant in that new position, right?
I think we've all seen people who have been promoted past their competency.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's several. They were really good at this job, but like you were saying, Chuck, they didn't either have the skills or want to invest in the things that they want to do at this higher level, and they want to keep doing this stuff. And that creates problems for everybody, because if you're suddenly the first sergeant, but you want to keep doing platoon sergeant thing, all the other platoon sergeants are going to resent you. And your company commander's not going to appreciate you, and your soldiers are going to suffer. Yeah. So, and
continually, and some of the stuff you have to educate yourself on is not fun, right?
No,
a lot of those doctrinal
boring
manuals and regulations, like, you're not like, man, this is awesome. You're going to read it, and you're going to have very low libido for maybe 2 weeks. But it's a requirement if you want to be competent, right, in your next job, because the Army doesn't pay you extra money, but like, you know what, here's some extra money and some more rank because, you're deserving. Like, no, I want you to understand more and take more responsibility and do these things. That's why we're paying you more money.
That's right.
And if you don't continue to read and educate and all the stuff that's definitely not fun to read, right? Like, I'm not reading TRADOC 350-70- whatever pamphlets on all these academic regulations. I'm like, man, this is great stuff. I'm like, man, this is just horrible. Like, I'm never going to get these hours of my life back. But then you take this stuff like we talked about, like, you use all those rules to your advantage. Like, no.
Yeah.
I need 16 instructors I didn't make this shit up. This is what it is.
That's right.
Here. And that's what the Army, we were having an argument with HQDA one day. They're like, well, explain to me why you need this. I'm like, okay, here, if you look on page whatever, this is signed off by the Secretary of the Army. I'm like, what? Are you sure? I'm like, that's just what it says. I mean, I didn't make this shit up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, then. I guess you'll get it.
Yeah. The Army is a bureaucracy. If you understand the bureaucracy, you'll be able to take care of your troops and your unit better. And that's our job as senior leaders, is go out there and learn it.
I think once you look at the whole thing as like a game, too,
yeah.
Like, man, it's a game. So the better I know the rules, and the rules are always changing. A lot of the rules are stupid. The rules don't care about Colonel Faint's opinion or my opinion, right? They just are.
That's right.
So
yeah, I wrote that down earlier when you were talking about know the game. I think that's a great way to do it. And of course, our game is very serious in our profession. But if you look at it that way, know the rules, you'll be better at it.
Yeah. And again, like you said, you don't have to be constrained by them.
No.
You should know them, though.
You should.
Yeah.
Know why you're getting in trouble later, or know why you be able to explain it. There have been several times where a subordinate or cadet or someone has done something that wasn't strictly in keeping with the rules necessarily, but when you start unpacking it, why did you do that? Okay, that makes sense. I understand why you did it. And sometimes it has a good ending and sometimes it doesn't, but I can understand it versus like I was selfish or I was lazy or something like that, in which case you're just going to get crushed.
Yeah.
And I hope that we don't go back to the Army that we had when I first joined, which was very risk averse. Everyone was afraid to do anything other than follow the straight path and not try to be innovative within the left and right boundaries.
Wear your PT belt during the day.
Oh, my God. I mean, my daughter teases me about that because I've talked about it so much, how much I hated that. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, I'm wearing my reflective belt. I'm a 6'5" white guy in a fob in Afghanistan, and I still got to wear a reflective belt in the middle of the day? This is dumb. I'm embarrassed.
Yeah. Don't put me in camouflage then.
Right.
Yep. There's a lot of stupidity in bureaucracy, or maybe it's not, right? If you know the rule, maybe it's not as stupid as you think it is. But as you move up in rank, and the one thing, when you finally read my book called "Don't Be a Sergeant Major," it talks about, which is not a real book, but I'm just saying, like, once you peek behind the curtain, like, that's what you get paid for. And there's a lot more stupidity and a lot more bureaucracy than people think there probably exists. But you can't unsee that stuff. But again, you have two options: you can bitch about it, or you can learn to dominate it. All right.
I think also, it certainly was the case for me, Chuck, as I gained more rank and experience, I gained the maturity to understand why some of these things I thought were stupid existed in the first place. It's like, okay, maybe this actually is the best way to do this now that I understand everything else that goes into it versus when I'm standing there, I'm like, those bastards at squad mentality.
Because you just don't have the full picture sometimes.
No, you don't.
Get up there, you're like,
I get it.
It's still stupid, but I understand why it's stupid, right?
Yeah.
So then you got to and you can put your energy only towards certain things. So am I going to affect this stupid thing that I'm probably not going to affect, or can I affect this thing over here that can actually have an impact, right? But anyway, I want to switch gears over to Havok Journal.
All right.
Real quick, last thing on MWI. If you go to the website and you look on the staff, the staff is pretty impressive. I mean, you got like Mark Esper on there. I mean, you got Patrick Sullivan. You have a large list of accomplished, well-named people. You got this guy in here, Charles Faint.
No one likes that guy.
But it's a large list of people that are fairly accomplished, smart.
Yeah.
Not all of them are military.
Right.
A lot of females in there.
Yep.
A couple bald guys. But it's pretty impressive. And then when you look at your fellows and your adjuncts, also very impressive. People from our regiment, the guy Alex Steep on here we were talking about earlier, and he was a company commander when I was on 1st Battalion, 3rd Special Forces Group. Just people from all different walks of really everything. It's not just something that's written by a couple high-ranking people at West Point.
No.
It's a whole array of people putting effort into this. I just thought that was impressive.
I'm glad you brought Alex Steep up because he's a friend, and I've talked to Alex several times over the year. Great guy. We taught together in the Department of Social Sciences. Very humble, great representative of the Special Forces Regiment. A great dude. And like you said, we have all manner of people, both on the staff and in our extended list of fellows and partners. It made me think of the fifth soft truth. Of course, most SOF operations require non-SOF support. Most MWI operations require non-MWI, non-military support too. So we have a lot of folks out there that are part of the MWI team. One more that I wanted to mention is the Joint Special Operations University down in Tampa. We have a burgeoning relationship with those guys as well. A lot of overlapping interests, and I think that's going to be good for both MWI and for the Joint Special Operations community having that partnership going forward.
That's awesome. For the last part of MWI, look on the website. I really hadn't looked at it too deep in the past. I listened to the podcast, but when you go in there, some of the things you can find in those articles are just really eye-opening. Like I printed out this article here on Lisco because he really dives deep into the doctrine. I'm like, okay, this person's they're singing my song, so let me go ahead. But you get on the rabbit hole, start reading more and more things. I wish I would have known about this resource a long time ago, especially for papers I was writing when I was down at JSOUT, the Sergeant Major's Academy down there, stuff like that. A lot of those things would have helped me, and then I would have had something to reference.
For sure.
I would say, do you consider it be peer-reviewed, or do you consider
it's not peer-reviewed yet, but I consider it a legit academic source. Yeah. Okay. So when my cadets cite MWI in their papers, it's legit. It's not like Wikipedia.
Awesome. So move over to Havok. Yeah. So I did print out this one. It's a little older article. It's by...
Is that the one by Alice Atalanta?
Yep. So, but it's interesting because I think that this is applicable today. It's entitled, "We Are Useful Idiots: How Our Nation is Being Divided Practically by all the other players in the Great Power Competition through all these troll farms, and how a divided America is not just something that these people have wanted as new. We've taught courses at the Academy from I don't know if you've heard of the Naked Communist and all the things that Russia has been doing forever to try to divide the country, and China too now, but how being divided is really just playing into the enemy hands, and how even a lot of our politicians, even if they're not, they're probably left and right should probably just be on the payroll of some other country because they're doing more harm than good. But I just found that was very interesting because you can go through the Havok Journal, and although it's not as academic as, say, MWI, a lot of those things, and reading this article, I didn't agree with everything this author had to say, right? But she provides the links to everything that she's talking about, so it gives you the ability to go in there and do your own research and formulate your own opinions on what they're talking about. And coming out, again, like we talked about, that critical thinking and just scrolling through a lot of those articles means everything, and you can find Havok Journal. I wonder about police stuff or ethics and, I don't know, a fire department or something. You can find something on the Havok Journal for that. So I just found that was, maybe I wouldn't write a paper and cite a lot of stuff from the Havok Journal, but for my own thought. And
that's exactly what it's for, just helping folks understand. And I'm glad you picked that one. Alice is kind of a great example of an author at Havok Journal. No military experience, but an amazing writer. Writes things that vets care about. She's also got a very interesting background. She's a fighter. She's a mixed martial arts fighter. She's a musician. And she's a freelance journalist. And she writes from us from time to time, and it's always great work. And I'm always glad to have it. This article nests well with what we have going on here in SWCC, because the PSYOP and this irregular warfare, relates closely to that, because that's one of the things we try to do to other countries, right? We try to divide the country, get people pitted against each other.
We're playing the same game. Whether people want to admit it or not, we play the same game, right?
Yes. But we don't like it when it's done for us. And we can see it. Folks like us know that this is going on, and it's very frustrating to see it happening in our own country, especially because the military is one of the few genuine melting pots left in the United States. People think it's college, but it's not. I spent a lot of time in a lot of colleges. I went to grad school at Yale before they sent me to West Point, and you can see the self-segregation that takes place. I'm not talking just racially, although that is a component. I'm talking ideologically. And one of the few places where that kind of just goes away for something that's bigger than ourselves is the military. And I'm worried that over time that might change, and we might see some of the same ideological, racial, whatever segregations that are going on in schools and the country in the military as well. And I hope we can try to avoid that.
Is that one of the reasons why you started the Havok Journal?
So Marty Scoveland started it, but that's one of the reasons I got involved in it. I like to write, and I didn't really have an outlet for it. It's actually harder to get published than people think. And one of the things that was hard for me getting started in the blogging world was my background was academic papers. So I was basically writing a bunch of crap that nobody wanted to read. Way too academic, way too long. What I found, and I don't know if you agree with this, Chuck, you might have a different measure. It seems about 1,000, 1,200 words is about what people can tolerate while they're scrolling through their phone.
In today's world, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe even that sometimes. I mean,
it's 800 words, something crazy.
You really got to get a hook in them.
You got to do it, which is why you need a great headline and a photo. That's what I found running the Havok Journal. The content is tertiary at best. You got to get them hooked in there, first of all, because if you're running a major media empire, which my Havok Journal is not, you need those clicks to drive ad revenue. But you need to get them in the door and then hit them with the content. Because we had several things that it's hard to tell what's going to resound. This was a huge article. Alice's article about useful idiots was huge for us. But there have been many times other articles that people have written, I'm not talking about my own necessarily, that I thought, this is a great article, everybody needs to read it, and nobody reads it.
Yeah.
And then we write this one-off. The most popular article on Havok Journal is one I wrote back when Marty still owned the company. That was like 5 things veterans want you to know or something like that. It was a listicle. It was garbage. I wrote it in 20 minutes at my in-laws' house, and it went bonkers. Millions of views, whatever. But I didn't want people reading that. I wanted to read stuff like what Alice is writing, but it's hard to tell what's going to resound. What I talked about with the guys that work with me on Havok Journal is, generally speaking, people would rather be entertained than informed. It's very frustrating.
Yeah. So how do you divide that gap, right?
Well, one of the things that we did, inspired by the Duffel blog, which I have a lot of love for, was we have a satire site called Article 107 News. Article 107 News UCMJ's false official statements. We thought that was very clever. And it was huge. I actually stopped writing articles for it because I would just get so depressed. I would write a stupid headline, a stupid article like Caitlyn Jenner was going to be the first female ranger, and watch people lose their minds over that. Or Bo Bergdahl got promoted to E7 since the 82nd and was awarded.
I remember that one going around, actually.
Yeah, well, that was one of I wrote that article. But despite the ridiculous photoshopping, ridiculous headline, and the satire disclaimer down the bottom, people thought it was real, and they're sending this around. So I stopped doing it because I want people to focus on the things that are real and important, like Alice's article. But they're not into that.
You don't want to be part of the disinformation campaign run by Russia and China.
I mean, I'm going to need a job soon, so whatever pays the bills. But it is frustrating to me, and I find myself doing the same thing. Most days, I don't want the heavy news. I want light. I want easy to understand things, and it's hard. You got to kind of make yourself get into articles like this. Listen to podcasts like this one that we're doing right now with the Underground. People don't want to do it, and it's just trying to crack that code and get people to educate themselves to make a better America.
There's a book that goes around in the graphic designer world called Don't Make Me Think, and it's all about how do you get people to click on things. And we've experimented with the podcast too. We put what we thought was a really creative thing, but the minute you make somebody think about it, if we could just make all of our downloads we're going to click on that, and it's like something like this, right? I mean, something we're like, I want to. That sounds like something I'm going to be entertained by, or. It's really weird, how we talk smack about clickbait stuff, but that is society, right?
It is. Well, one of the first articles I wrote for MWI before I was affiliated with it, and I give them big credit for actually running this article, it was called Competition, Call of Duty, and Naked Chicks with Guns. And they ran that headline on it and ran my article. Now, obviously, it's not what people think it's about. It's about my experiences in the 160th in Afghanistan. But that headline is, whatever gets people in church. whatever gets them in the door, so they get that leadership lesson. And that relates to what you're talking about right now. You shouldn't have to. Here's an article on leadership in in Afghanistan. No one's going to read that. There's so much of that in there. But you put a provocative headline on there. You put a provocative image on there. People are going to click on it, and then you can get them the content.
Yeah. It's been a learning curve for us here, but it's interesting, right? It's like, wow, like you said, it's a great article. Everybody should read this. Well, how do you get them to read it?
Right.
So, and you own the Havok Journal, so you have to deal with that.
I do. What's great about running Havok is it's a side hustle, and it's a hobby that makes a little bit of money. That's really what it is. I remember the first article that I published was under a clever pseudonym. I don't remember what it was, but it was for when Ranger Up had their own blog. I wrote an article for them. Even though it wasn't my name, the fact that it got published felt so good for me, and I like doing that for other people, especially vets. For us, for a Havok Journal, it's got to be true. It's got to be interesting, and it's got to be something that it's got to be true. It's got to be well written. It's got to be something that'll interest the veteran community. If it's one of those three things, I don't care who writes it. We've had kids write articles for us before, because we just want that information out there.
So if somebody in the formation wants to write for Havok, if you got something they want to get out there, like how do they go about?
Havok Journal at havokmedia.org. I know they won't remember that email address. They just come to the site. It's in there. They can email. Scott Faith is the name, the pseudonym associated with the account. They email Scott, and Scott will get back to them, and we'll tell them we use it or not. We don't publish everything that we get, but we're pretty generous about it. Mike Jr. is a great editor, very patient with authors. I think one thing that holds back, not just talking Havok, but for any publication, is a lot of people in the military think they can't write. They got a great story to tell, but I'm not a great writer. That's why we have editors. That's why we have people that know how to do podcasts. You and I aren't going to edit this podcast. We have some, we know.
This gentleman over here knows what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly right. So, and it's the same thing with writing. So if you have something to say, make it the best you can and put it out there, because people want to hear what you got to say. And Chuck, I don't know if you've seen this as well. The hardest demographic to get people to write, go on podcasts, do anything is female vets. 100% hardest demographic to crack. And my wife's a vet. She was in for 10 years. She was in the 101st 2ID and JSOC. But she doesn't think that her story's as good as whatever. I've only done this. I haven't done this. Sorry to say, most of us aren't two-time Silver Star recipients, so we haven't done that. But we've done something else that someone else will relate to. So I wish more female vets would let Havok or Modern War or Pineland Underground or whatever tell their story, because it needs to be told, and it's interesting. That book I mentioned earlier that Marty Scoveland wrote, that I co-authored with him, about the Ranger Regiment, to me the most powerful story in that book wasn't written by a Ranger or a support guy. It was written by a Ranger mom named Scotty Dome, whose son Chris got killed on his 14th deployment. To me, that's the best story in that entire book, and I think a lot of people can relate to that in ways they can't relate to other stories too.
Yeah. All right, so let's hit that risk piece. What are your thoughts on risk in the military?
Ours is an inherently risky profession. Think about to my time in the 160th, we did a lot of risky things there. The pilots did. I was safely back at the FOB. The place that we lost pilots that I knew was not in combat, but their helicopter fell out of the sky, and the crash, a bunch of folks died on it. And you can get backed over in the motor pool. You can have a mortar round explode to you in training, get accidentally shelled. So ours is an inherently risky profession, and whatever we can do as leaders to reduce that risk, we need to do so. However, we still need to be able to take risks, accept prudent risk as part of the principles of mission command. And I think a lot of young leaders are reluctant to do that. And making decisions, you tell people to do things that could result in their death. Or injury, or bad career, or just simply a bad decision. But you can't be afraid to do that, because in the long run, you put more people more at risk if you take those shortcuts and you're afraid to go out and do the things you need to do. And I'm thinking about my time in Iraq towards, 08, 09, maybe down towards the end there, where entire units were trying to button up and not leave the FOB. And what they were doing was they thought they were protecting their people. What they're doing is conceding freedom of movement to the enemy.
Doing your mission, right? That's when
exactly
you get stuck
right.
in that. Well, I was successful because I brought everybody home, right?
That's yeah.
If that's your primary goal is not the mission.
That's right.
Not to say that you're like, oh, we're just going to go here and get everybody killed. But if you're trained into that, or you're in the rear, if you're always risk averse, you are trained into that, even if it's inadvertently. You have a mission. You join the military. Like you said, it's a risk averse. It's a risky job.
Yes.
You can't be risk averse all times.
Yes. So many young leaders in particular overlook what we call disease and non-battle injury, DNBI, which historically has taken more troops out of the battlefield than anything else. I'm talking about subcivils not washing your hands. We like to make fun of that and things like that. But if you look at the things that have taken people out of combat, not necessarily fatalities, but reduced that combat power, it's things like pregnancy. It's things like alcohol consumption. It's things like being sick, dysentery, and things like that. Basketball is one of the highest casualty producing weapons the enemy has, and God knows about soccer. So we need to take risks, but we need to do it prudently. And I think a lot of young leaders are either too risk averse, or they're just like accept all the risk in the world without thinking critically about it. Yes.
Side,
Yeah. So I've seen that a number of times in my life, and I think that it goes back to experience and thinking, which is what we were talking about right before the break. And I wrote this down. You said it. I thought it was a great point. Thinking's hard. A lot of people don't want to do it. It's mentally exhausting. And a lot of people have trouble shifting gears between what you think about operationally and what you're thinking about in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And certainly that was for me too. I went back to grad school very late in my career. I became a lieutenant colonel while I was in grad school. So here I am. I'd been in 5th Group, the 160th JSOC, 7 deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan. And then suddenly I'm back in the classroom. What am I doing here? I don't know how to do that. Like the style that you write an academic paper in is not the kind that you write an op order in, or the kind you even write an intel report. So for me, I had to adjust to that. It was also adjustment for me personally, in that I was way older than all my classmates, even in grad school. And I had to take a foreign language. So I was in there with a bunch of 18-year-olds. So in my Spanish class, which I took because I thought I could learn Korean in grad school, and it turns out I can't. In my Spanish class, not only was I older than all of my fellow students, I was older than the professor. So that's a tough sell also. And I could see how that might happen at SWIC if you got an 18 series NCO who's there and there's got a young instructor who's never been to combat. Why are you teaching me how to do this when I've been doing this for years? Mm-hmm. Do you see any of that here, Chuck? Have you had to deal with that over the time that you were in?
Yeah, that's pretty prevalent, right? It's just what it is. It's in the military.
So like we were saying, thinking's hard, and adjusting to thinking different. There's a famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which I thought was very useful. Yes, I encourage all the listeners in the underground to read that. It was that Kahneman, I think, that wrote that, and the different types of thinking and when you need to use it. Mm-hmm. And I think too many people don't think enough about anything. They just accept the world around them and don't try to make it better.
I think a good thing to do, though, and this is what I was going to say earlier, is when you're thinking, though, like I think journaling gets, like, people don't do it enough, but if you're thinking about something, that's fine, but that's easily, it's like a fart in the wind, right? It could be gone. But when you write things down, and even writing it with a pen versus on a computer forces your brain to accept the things that you're thinking about, and then you can think through them in a different manner, too. I think that's something that I wish I would have done a lot earlier in my life.
So there's pedagogy behind what you just said, and that's one of the reasons until literally this past year, I did not allow electronic devices in my classroom. For one, I know what I was doing on the computer when I was in school, and I wasn't paying attention to the professor. Yeah. But for also, there is science behind you going through the trouble of writing something down helps cement it in your brain in a way that it doesn't when you just type it out. Yeah. So I think that's helpful also. And my dad was in the Army for 26 years. He was an SF guy back before it was his own branch. And recently he started giving me all his stuff, and he's got journals that he's kept in those little green notebooks, little black notebooks. And fortunately, unlike me, he's got really good handwriting. So I think that's useful as well.
It goes back to the old rule, right? If it's not written, it's not real.
That's right. Picture it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If it's not written down or recorded somewhere, it never happened.
Yeah, it's like a contractual agreement with yourself too, because now you put the effort into the thinking, but now you put more effort into the writing part. So
yes.
Now you're kind of obliged to, like, well, this is what I was thinking about, okay. And then it sticks.
Yeah.
Or you can say, well, I thought it didn't look quite as right when I wrote it out, so maybe I need to test this,
That's right.
So, yeah, I think that's a very powerful thing to do, especially when you're talking about, you're switching between the types of thinking you're doing if you're going from operational academic, right? Because there's a difference in training and education and doing. Training is very technical and tactical. Now when you're moving to the education piece, that's when you're stepping back. We like to use the analogy upstairs, which for the academy is up to a certain point in your career, the chess piece. You're expected to be very good at doing the things that you do, radios and doing this small thing. But then at a certain point, you're going to hit that delta where now the Army's paying you more money or the military's paying you more money because they expect you to take this step back, and now they want you to become the chess player. and understand the rules of the game so you can dominate the game. But with thinking, it's the same thing. Like, so you can think about these specific things here operationally, but then when you move into the more theoretical environment, you have to change the way you think about it and the way you're willing to accept facts and things that are brought to your attention to where you can poke holes in it and have that to where you are at cognitive overload and you're like, man, I am smoked because I've been thinking too much about all this different stuff, and then writing it down and just testing what you think is real versus what's not real, or what's applicable versus what's not applicable. It's much different than just coming to work and doing every day versus, okay, now I got to think about all this stuff, because it's not something that's pragmatic every day where you can just do things with it. You got to think about it. The real test there is, yes, now I have all this theory and knowledge. How do you apply that back to the chessboard?
That's right.
Because if you can't do that, you just wasted all the time and effort anyway.
Yeah, because you're not there just to receive the information. You're going to practically apply it in some capacity down.
I think a lot of people miss that link too, because you people are like, okay, that's a great theoretical whatever. And you're like, okay, how do I apply that? Well, I don't know. I've just been spending all these years on this PhD to come up with a theory. I don't know how it actually works, like in a practical manner. Right? You see both sides of that.
Yeah.
So where the lower level doesn't understand the theoretical level doesn't really understand how to apply the great stuff they've come up with.
I think that's brilliant. That's one of the reasons I like the branch detail program so much. So you get the tactical grounding before you go off to become a signal officer, intelligence officer, chemical corps officer. And we know what those individuals that we're supporting needs because we've done it.
Yeah.
So not essential. My wife was a great intel officer and she was straight MI, but I think it's very helpful.
I think this goes back to our whole conversation about that continuing education.
Yes.
Always continually educating yourself on, okay, this is what I'm doing here, but this is the academia behind that. And then how do you apply that back to what's real? And
Yes.
what's going on the ground. I think that continuum and understanding that as you go up into higher and higher levels in the Army, you're going to be less at that tactical level and more at that, strategic level, in the nebulous, head in the clouds. But then if you can't figure out how to apply what it is you're coming up with to the reality, then you're wasting time too.
It's not helpful. That's right.
So yeah, it's just that continuum. Continually educating yourself on everything.
On everything you can, because you never know where you're going to use it. I never thought we'd be back in Afghanistan or Iraq. I never thought I'd be in the Philippines doing what I was doing there, which was very interesting. You never know who you're going to run into. I think something else that young people underestimate is the value of a personal network. Because I think a lot of them see it as something negative, like networking or just like cronyism or something like that. But none of us get through this alone. And the bigger your network is and the more time you invest in it, the more it'll pay off for you down the road.
That's super true. Well, we're right here at the limit of our podcast, Charles. Do you go by Charles or do you go by Chuck?
Charlie, Charles, whatever. It's all
I go by
good.
Chuck. So it's always weird being in the room with another Charles.
Too few of us.
Yeah, truly appreciate you coming in and do this. And, I'm glad we got to really dig into, the MWI and the Havok Journal, because it's been eye-opening for me. And I hope that people listening will dig into these resources. And then if you want to write for Havok Journal, reach out, go through those, and put some awesome stuff in there, right? Like you said, most people don't think they can write, but most people have good stories to tell. Right. They have awesome information, and you have editors that can help them out.
Mike's a great editor.
So
keep him busy.
Awesome.
I'm thrilled to be here, and I hope we get you up at West Point, you and your team up at some point. There's a lot going up there. It's worth the trip.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, man.
All right.
Thanks for joining us today in Pineland Underground, the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and Schools official podcast.
Please tune in to our next episode. We release episodes every 2 weeks.
You can reach us at pinelandunderground@gmail.com. Check it out.